Everybody, it's 9 o'clock. Get your coffee if you haven't gotten any, and snacks to fuel you through the morning. So welcome back to Water Literate Leaders, our second session. This session is going to be focused on, so last month we heard kind of about some background on water in the West from Dr. John Tracy. We heard a lot of water history from Patty Reddick. This week, we're going to get deep dive into water law and administration. And we've got, first off, we're going to just start with a little bit of discussion from what we learned last week and kind of recap, you know, what you thought was interesting, kind of your homework that you did and share some thoughts on that. And then we're going to get through some of our presentations. We're going to have a leadership challenge from Jenny Arndt, the mayor of Fort Collins. She's spoken here at a few of our different cohorts and gives an amazing presentation. We're very excited to have her back. And then we'll hear a little bit on Colorado River water law specifically. We'll get into a little skill development. So last session, we heard from Martine Carcassonne kind of about this wicked problem and how we approach those problems and kind of, you know, where we're at right now in our polarized society. And this aspect of skill development is really going to get at what I think is kind of the foundation of building trust, which is listening and being open to other people's perspectives and really trying to understand those perspectives, not from the intention of, you know, trying to manipulate or control, but from the intention of building trust and really trying to understand people. So we're going to do a little bit of that, and then we'll get into some details on our assignments and book club. I think some of you are already starting to work on that, so that's exciting. And yeah, so I'll just kick it off with kind of opening up. So I get a copy of all of your replies on your homework, and I try and look at themes that emerge and kind of main takeaways that you all are thinking about. One of the things I wanted to bring up, which was I think it was Jason who sent the article, right? I'm not going to pinpoint your homework responsibility. The article that you sent about something we had just talked about, which is, you know, increasing water fees and prices and how that affects affordable housing. And then we had an article from Jason that basically described an initiative from Fort Collins Utilities that was going to potentially dramatically increase, you know, housing cap fees in Fort Collins. And that was a concern that I heard even before that article, but in your responses was kind of this water pricing and equity piece and how we're addressing that in our community. So does anyone want to kind of kick us off with some conversation? And Nick, maybe you can update us on where that's
Sorry.
Yeah.
The update is, I guess the process worked. In that we made the initial presentation and got substantial amounts of feedback from the community, the development community, our elected officials and everything, to the point where we just decided to essentially scrap the entire thing and go back to the proverbial drawing board and start to take another look at it. The good news, bad news, depending on your viewpoint, is as part of that conversation, they've realized they were only looking at one fee and one aspect of the entire process and not the entire kind of portfolio and the entire cost of what it takes to get water from all the way to the tap for a development, commercial, residential, anything like that. So they've really zoomed out and are starting to take a more holistic approach at the entire package of fees and the entire cost of that. As you all know, in the government world, that means it's going to take a lot longer to get a resolution and a much broader conversation. But I think realistically is the correct approach to it. There's a lot more conversation around the equity, around the housing affordability aspect. And if you just start charging people $30,000 for development to get water, well, the developer's not just gonna eat that cost. That's of course just gonna get tacked on to whatever. And are there ways to mitigate that? Is that the best way, the best methodology to handle that? We've also started to have a conversation around water allotments. Currently in Fort Collins, water allotments are only assessed for about 150 commercial customers, right? And so looking at expanding that, and do we expand that to all of our commercial customers? Do we expand that to a specific segment based off square footage, revenue, usage, whatever? What does that delineation line look like? And then how do you handle who gets what for a water allotment? And again, the equity component. And because right now, frankly, in Fort Collins, it'll cost you about $120,000 if you want to open a restaurant just in water fees. And that's functionally untenable, right? I mean, that kills business. So how do we address that? Also, within the context of, our water rights portfolio has increased 300% in the past 200 years. How do we pay for that? How do we ensure that we have water in our portfolio for all the people that want to come and live in our community? So this turned into a much longer rambling answer. I didn't mean to monopolize the entire conversation, sorry, but the short of it is there's a much larger conversation in play. We've realized that we have to have a much larger conversation. We can't just live within the isolated bubble of the water supply rates requirement. And we don't have a lot of answers right now. It's the good news is we pushed it back a year, so nothing's gonna happen like in the brink of January 24th, but a lot more conversations to come.
Isn't it true that the Fort Collins water tap fee is at the low end? I mean, right,
For the region,
for the region? Or is it in the middle? Where is it?
this is where my marketing brain takes over.
Yeah.
That means you have to tell the truth.
The truth is, Fort Collins water is one of the cheapest in the northern Colorado area. We actively avoid, from a marketing standpoint, trying to compare ourselves to other communities, be it water rates, like power, electricity, anything like that. But that's the cold hard reality of it, is water is pretty cheap in Fort Collins relative to a lot of our neighbors.
So that's really interesting because Greeley looks at Fort Collins and Loveland and Longmont, and when we are adjusting our water rates, but we include water and sewer and stormwater in thinking about that, so.
I remember because it was when Tom was mayor, and they pushed up some of the developers, real estate went bananas, and so. And they made a list, and it was, again, all the communities surrounding us, and you guys really, because again, people pointed to, why is Windsor, why are they so much less? But when you started looking at and going forward to what your bills would be, then it's just getting people, but you have to give that as a whole to people to understand what that is. So even though you say, you try not to, but it does get compared into that.
It totally does, and it's kind of one of those dirty little secrets, I guess, of the utility space. And in Fort Collins, we're in a particularly odd situation politically in that we're in a co-op essentially with power things with Longmont, Loveland, Estes. And so we're in a direct partnership with them. So it's this weird, we are in competition, but we're not because we're vested partners. And so then on the water side, there's kind of a little bit of a holdover of that too, of we're not partners with you, and there's tons of different water districts in the area, but also we don't have it won't do us any good to go around with a stick poking other people going, our rates are lower, our rates are,
I think this is an interesting conversation because I just went to Water and Sewer Board this morning with our rate study for all three of our utilities. And we do get that question every time. Well, what are we like? Where are you at in bell curve with everybody else? And it's taken about almost 5 years now for that question not to be as frequent and to be the main focus. Because of hearing what everybody has said here, there's so many different levers in each of our sections. It's like comparing fruit salads. We're kind of a spicy fruit salad and they're not, and so we try to make sure that they understand all the things that's playing in their kitchen. We have that unique 3 different water providers, which is our treatment costs, right? So I think it's an interesting conversation.
we have an additional challenge in Fort Collins, not really the Fort Collins Water District is only the northern half of the city.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And
We had the same situation. I went to the south end.
yeah,
And, we had a big debate last Tuesday. And obviously the tap fees are one of the issues. You penalize, no, first of all, inflation hit everybody, no question. Labor, materials, everything you want to talk is going up. So it's gotta be passed on to somebody or they're gonna go broke. And, so who do you hit? You hit the little old lady and grab, we have 3 tiers of our water. We have, obviously, like you guys, you have, 10,000 categories of water. But like tier 1, 2, or 3. Tier 1 is a little lady has a house, a small house. You want her to live comfortably, so there's one rate for that. Bigger house and bigger house again. So you pass it on, who do you pass it on to? You have to pass it on to someone.
right.
And we recognize the developers, if you hit them, they're gonna pass it on. But new people coming here, somebody's gotta pay these costs.
Yeah.
And you penalize the existing people who paid 30 years ago or 10 years ago,
Sure.
well, you're gonna get farmers.
And hold on 1 second. Dennis, will you introduce yourself? I'm sorry, we haven't had an introduction.
This is the first section, the first on vacation, last month, missed it. I'm Dennis Fines. And I'm on the board of directors of the Fort Collins Local Water District. We've always had 4 members plus the chairman. And whenever I always have an associate, I was associate and I just made last 2 years, so somebody helps me, if somebody drops off. When I move somebody in quickly. And I came from back east 8 years ago. And both the east and the west have water problems. One has too much, one has too little. And it's an interesting conundrum you're in. And how do you balance these things? That's one of the questions I keep raising with the board. For instance, use your example with Collins. You have somebody that has a house, he pays so much. You gotta have new houses. But then you have a couple of breweries in here, which are big and large breweries. You get tremendous amounts of water. Is it fair to everybody else that they get all this water? I think agriculture gets 80%, and some of the crops that are grown are not high desert crops.
Yeah.
Arizona used to be one of the largest cotton producers of all places. The land's fertile, but no water, but they grow a lot of cotton. It took a lot of water. A friend of mine lives in Chico, California. Sent me a clipping of his newspaper once, and you go up a can of pistachio, to pull out one pistachio, one nut, 100 gallons of water for that one nut. Think of that, and these grows out there. Now they're being replaced with other crops. That's gonna happen.
Appreciate Dick's response. I think, and I'm sure if we give Jenny the opportunity to talk about it, she'll go on. But from a procedural standpoint, I mean, the council was pretty upset about the way that was handled, sending those notices. And kind of looking at who sent this out. Was it Jason Graham? Was it Kelly DiMartino? And I think there's some pretty upset city leaders about that. In my opinion, the consultant was very, very narrow-minded, and his focus was on, he didn't look at the whole thing holistically. And I just think his numbers were incorrect. I mean, I will tell you, I have water under contract to a buyer right now at a record price, and it's about $66,000 an acre foot, not 180. So wherever he got his numbers, he's way off the mark. And in terms of the overage, remember, I'm going to use Raintree Shopping Center. You guys are all familiar with Raintree Shopping Center as an example. They tend to go over a little bit every year. Our company manages that. So all that overage water gets assessed back to all those tenants, right? So now you gotta think all the small businesses in there gotta take the brunt of it. It's probably on a pro rata share. I'm not sure how they do it, or if they're separately metered. You know, maybe it's just the gym. I don't really know. So if you take that overage cost that all these small businesses, they just got hit so hard in the face with the tax increases. Remember, Colorado has the highest commercial tax rate in the country at 27.5%. And you, I believe, the second lowest residential. So your houses, yeah, it went up, but not significantly. And all the leases are strictly triple net. You know, and probably, you know, additional rent on pro rata share of utilities. So if we have this allotment go up, all these small businesses are gonna get hit really, really hard. If where they're at didn't have the initial raw water, you know, if the developer put enough raw water into that, maybe, let's just say a 2-inch tap versus a 1.5-inch tap. They took that cost up front, the raw water dedication up front, they're not gonna be affected, but if they're underserved, that all those overage costs are gonna affect all these small businesses. So, I mean, this is not a business friendly community. It's not from planning and zoning and from now water, so changes need to be made. So.
I saw David.
Sorry.
Oh, well, no, I was gonna just ask more of like a question for Tatum, you know, from a brewery standpoint, because that's one of the things that helps kind of define some of these regions. I mean, could you guys rebuild what you have today, knowing that raw water costs 150,000+ an acre feet? You know, is that something that is even sustainable to get a quality, more local brewery versus a national or international chain?
It makes it a lot harder. I think it depends. There's two kind of schools of thought. One is based on some breweries that own their property, and one is based on small breweries that rent or lease their property, because that goes into what David was just saying, where then if there are water overages in the shopping mall that they're in, of course, they're gonna get the harvest of that if it's separately metered. Our perspective is that because we don't distribute outside the state of Colorado, like the water all eventually gets back into the system, right? So we have, I mean, that's true. It's hard with the large regional or national breweries. That's not the case, right? They're shipping to the East Coast, they're shipping to the West Coast. Probably needed the West Coast, right? But our hope is that that remains accessible for small breweries, because the likelihood is that the product stays here, creates jobs in the community, but it also keeps the community impact local. And from a water perspective, that's sort of where we look at it. We try to, like, our water use is much below the national average. Most of the Fort Collins breweries have that as the case, because we're very aware that it's a problem. We're also lucky that we have some of these larger regional and national breweries, because they do a ton of testing and work on water quality. And so that trickles down to us in a way that, like, those systems we would never be able to afford, and they wouldn't make sense for, there just aren't those facilities for breweries of our size. We made 2,500 barrels of beer last year. Like, New Belgium makes 1 million, you know, Anheuser-Busch makes 13 million from this plant alone. So that type of scalability is not something that applies to us, but also we're not sending it anywhere else. Like, we go to, there's one bar in Telluride that has our beer. Okay, it's pretty much mostly in Colorado. So our goal is to get our consumption down low, but also then to have that remain here, so that, again, eventually it all gets back into the local water supply, one way or another. So, yeah, it kind of depends on, I think the lease, we own our building, and that was really important for us. I don't know if that would be as possible these days, just with the startup costs.
We just have some local folks that are scrambling both here in Fort Collins and in Windsor, trying to get building permits or do things, because Windsor going up 27% next year too. We're gonna hit that $100,000 mark, and for, as a small town, that's like a big number in their head when they're running their pro forma. So they're like trying to figure out how can they get ahead of that curve before it jumps up another $20,000+.
And it's expensive to, like, stainless steel costs a lot of money, and that's what you need for a brewery, right? And so if you can balance that with more accessible business practices in other parts of the business, that helps a lot. But I think we're probably gonna see a turn more toward people leasing facilities that already exist, because it's just having great, like, building from the ground up, or even just providing to, like, our space used to be an automobile shop, like, it didn't have the facilities that we needed, but we also bought it 12 years ago. So, you know, it balances out for us, but I don't know if it will for people moving forward.
It's one of those conversations where if our water district has a certain cost to access water, but we're only in the northern half of the city, it almost becomes a planning problem. at a certain point, because if I'm building a new business and it's cheaper to get water from the southern district than to shut down there, even though in Fort Collins, all the old town, all the historic, there's this emphasis on placing this economic development on the northern half of the city. It also becomes, again, zooming out, and looking at the holistic picture of what is the cost of doing business in Fort Collins, because here's what it costs to get water. But then there's also these energy efficiency programs that are coming down the pipeline. There's also the irrigscaping that's coming down the pipeline, and all of a sudden you're at $500,000 before you've even opened your door or invested anything on the actual business side of things, right? Just in fees and costs and real estate and all that. And that's untenable, right? Nobody wants that from a business perspective. So it's just so fascinating to me how we start off our conversation on this one limited fee, and the next thing you know, we're looking at the entire damn puzzle. And holy crap, it's huge, right? And what levers do you pull to go in the right direction to move your community and the way you want it?
Let's try that beautiful mind.
It's very, yeah, it's, you joke, literally.
I have a question on the part. What is your first attack? A lot of development land. And I think I heard this last weekend last week that our district, only 40% of the land that's developed is it up. That means 60% is getting to come in houses or whatever. How do you guys, you're more densely populated, but,
Yeah, in our water district, I forget the exact number, but it's in the single digits of.
so you're not much less, you're pretty much filled up where we're looking for the future and buying what we
So then it either becomes a boundary issue or it becomes well, how do you update the infrastructure that you have or pass on that cost? I mean, we're looking at a $300+ million reservoir expansion project.
Yeah.
How are we going to pay for that, frankly? Because if we pass that on to every single ratepayer, that's, oof, don't do that.
I was gonna ask, we're talking about cost of water, and it seems like it's really a statewide issue, right? It's not just, the CBT water is a thing. But how do we have that conversation at a larger scale and thinking about, other states and communities that have similar water scarcity problems? They have similar growth, very rapid growth, and yet their costs of water are significantly lower. And so how can we, bring that discussion to the powers that be and start having some real conversations about what's going on here and how can we, what we can do to address this issue? Because I think, obviously our communities are struggling with this problem, and it seems like we don't have the tools ourselves to address it, right? So.
We touched on that a little bit last time.
Yeah.
Just the cost of, it's not just pulling drinking water into the treatment plant and then into the taps. It's pulling from this diversion project, to this conversion project, to this ditch company, to this ditch company, and every layer adds on this additional fee. How do you structurally redo that?
I was understanding that it is.
I mean, you add on 10, 15, 20% real quick before you get to the tap. That
That's
other
true.
communities just fundamentally don't have to deal with.
Sure. Yeah.
Two things, we'll have to call Tom and tell him he was right, he was seeing ahead. But secondly, I was just in Phoenix this weekend, and my ire was just raised, just going through some communities of houses that still had grass. And real grass, and they were real grass, and I'm thinking, why is there any real grass down here? It was 120 degrees for I don't know how many days, and thinking about the water that was getting used onto that. We were in Airbnb with somebody, walked out back to check the pool, and I am not kidding you, the back, you almost sunk, it was so wet. And I was so mad, I was like, why is there so much water going into here after being into this class and thinking that? And then the water coming out of the tap, I drank water out of the tap, it was horrendous. It tasted horrible. And most places that I go, I don't notice the water being much different, but it was awful. And I'm thinking, what are you not spending money on the treatment of your water that it tastes horrible, but yet you're throwing it onto these, I don't know, it just made me, after being through this and sitting through some of this stuff, again, I don't understand, when so much of that water, when you watch, I was telling Jason, when we were watching that Great Divide and how much goes off to Arizona, and California, get it, population, I understand. But to me, that's a complete waste of it. I feel like it is. When you're in a desert community, that the temperature is something you can't control, but what you can control is, maybe your landscaping and stuff. I don't know. it was just something to me that came after this class that it was just, it very much came to the point.
This one,
I didn't wait to come in here and talk about it. There's people that was saying we wouldn't have understood.
Yeah, I lived in Tucson for 5 years and it was always like, Tucson's like, we've got tons of xeriscape and doing a great job of reduced water use in the urban environment. And Phoenix was like, love to be on.
just wanted to share from the ag side of things also real quick, when you're talking about water, it's not just the cities or the municipalities that are struggling with this. I mean, if this was probably 10 years ago, out where I live, in Cook County, Will County, I was looking at 40 acres right next to my house to buy just 40 acres, which isn't too much, especially if you're looking at productive ag ground. And the gentleman I was looking to buy it from said, I cannot afford to sell it with any water. And so then I started the process of calling the ditch company to see how much a share of water would cost me to efficiently or adequately irrigate that ground. The ground was gonna cost me, 100 to 120,000, somewhere in that range for 40 acres. For water, exactly the same. And I remember going into the county commissioners at the time, and this is before I started working with the county, and venting to them saying, how in the world can anybody who wants to get into ag, who is not one of these legacy people, and I come from a legacy farm, you guys know that from my intro, but I'm not looking to take over my grandpa's dairy farm and farm that ground. That's going down the path of my uncle, right? But I was looking to get into it myself. How in the world can anybody afford it? So to your point, it's not just businesses in the area, it's not just the municipalities. It's literally a problem if you have younger people who want to get into the ag world. How can you do that? There's almost no way to do that right now, unless you have a legacy family farm that you're gonna ride the coattails of, so it's an issue.
I think, Karen, to your point, from my perspective, I'm not angry that it is expensive to get water here. It is frustrating that it is very inexpensive to get water elsewhere. Like, I am willing, if that's the cost of what it takes to get the water to my production facility, to my home, to wherever, that's the cost that I'm willing to pay. The frustrating part is that other people are not paying that cost and are sometimes irresponsibly using water, or at least not as responsibly as we perfect could be doing it, right? So, and so I think it's not necessarily, I don't feel, well, it'd be great if it were cheaper, but if it's not, if that's the actual cost that it takes to have good water, because from our perspective, good water makes good beer, so we're happy to have that. But also, just like, I love getting tap water here. We have friends come visit from elsewhere and they're like, oh my gosh, you drink out of the tap? You don't have a Brita? I'm like, no, it's really good. So I'm happy that we are able to do that here. The thing that is interesting, and from like a regional and national conversation perspective, is how do we get that to be equal where this water is going? Right, if we're using it here and we're paying $1 for X amount of water, and then it goes downstream and someone's paying 12 cents for X same amount of water, but it took this much more infrastructure to get there, this much more people and time and labor to get there. It's very frustrating. Like, that part is what is concerning to me, is that it's making this area less accessible, which is not awesome. But it's making other areas where there is a ton of scarcity of water more accessible, which seems like the opposite of what should be happening. So that's where I'm like, if this is the cost that it takes, I'm willing to pay that cost, and that is the cost that I have agreed to by choosing to live here. And if other people were carrying some portion of the infrastructure and the labor and just the process, what would that do to kind of create equity across where all of this water is going?
There's also a situation that I learned about recently. There's an area north of Denver, we'll put it that way. They've always had low rates. And now all of a sudden their infrastructure started to fail. And where does that money come? They don't have the reserves for that. And that's one of the reasons we try to keep our rates at I call fair level, what we'll call it. It's just so you can pay for. People think they turn the water on, hey, turn the tap on and get a glass of water. Okay, it comes down to the Rocky Mountains, it's Rocky Mountain pure, it's coarse, you come down and you drink it. You don't realize the pipes, the infrastructure, the sewage treatment, all that goes into it. So we're trying to stay ahead of that. Some cities have apparently not, and they're behind you, behind the power grid.
That's my city.
Pardon?
That's my city. So Johnstown is very behind, right? Yeah.
Other city besides that.
I know it is. It happens everywhere. And then we're trying to catch up and we also see like you guys have flat rates. How do I compete with that, right? Like it's a struggle that we're all having, rate study wise.
An example could be like Graham Oilfield used to say, you can pay me now or pay me later. You can change your oil and spend X dollars getting it changed for $100,000 by a home convention.
Well, now you
This
can
is,
pay,
you can pay the infrastructure, you don't.
you're talking about the small woman, the little woman who
Yeah.
needs to pay.
So, and I don't
They have to pay their share.
I can say that can only see you yourself.
Like in general, like, I can't afford for them not to pay because it's been neglected, so
Right.
it's not an
Yeah,
option.
no, I understand. That's, these are policy decisions that everybody has to make. And
I think the other piece to the Arizona piece, we had a public works director who came over from Arizona a couple years ago. And I was trying to talk to him about water and it's how they calculate their water's value, right? Like they assume they have so much groundwater that they can use and then they can continue to develop off of that. We don't use that calculation. So we're all comparing water and the value of water differently. How do we get on the same page?
Yeah.
Right?
It's been a big thing in the water supply calculation. Our portfolio has gone up 300% valuation.
Yeah.
What does that really mean? You're never gonna sell that.
No.
Something is worth whatever you can get somebody to pay you for it, so.
Yeah, we're kind of buying the mentality that water's more valuable, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's part of the problem.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up here because we have our first speaker today. Get her real quick. So we are going to hear from Whitney Coulter. And she is from the Fisher Brown Bartlett Larson and Irby. She's an associate at their law firm. She joined the law firm in the fall of 2018 after a year-long clerkship with Chief Judge Hartman in Water Division 1. She obtained her bachelor's and master's degree in journalism. Her first job at a newspaper, the Greeley Tribune, brought her to Colorado. After a few years reporting on crime courts and ultimately agriculture in northern Colorado, Ms. Coulter decided to pursue a legal career and attended the University of Denver Stern College of Law, where she earned her Juris Doctorate degree in 2017. Her interest in water law stems from growing up on her family farm in southeastern Idaho. A place to think about water.
Yeah.
So welcome, Whitney, and we are going to hear about a very quick dip into Colorado water law. So take it away, and we have a clicker there.
Oh, yay, all right. Do people typically stand?
You can.
I'm a stander, I think. Did I already turn it off? It's like motion activated or something. Alright, this topic always makes me laugh a little bit because Colorado water law is so involved and we like to go into the history of how we got to where we are, particularly in northern Colorado. Water rights in Colorado are generally the same concept, but here in northern Colorado with the Cashel River and the Big Thompson River, we have some unique aspects. And quite honestly, that's probably all we really care about here in northern Colorado. And so we'll focus on that, but so we'll try to do a quick dive. And I am hoping to answer every question that keeps you up at night about water law. I'm sure many of you have them. I do want to just, before we get started, understanding, I did take a quick look at the roster, the lineup for Water Literate Leaders. I saw some municipal experts in the room. Can you maybe just give me an indication if you're with a municipality? Okay, quite a few municipalities. I saw some real estate experts in the room. Yeah, okay. And a brewery. Where's our brewery person? Okay. Which brewery?
That's called Horse and Dragon. We're here in Fort Collins.
Maybe too early to think about that.
Never to.
And then so municipality, real estate, brewery, anybody, who am I missing, I guess, in terms of representation? Nonprofit, hey, conservation. Oh, okay, wonderful. Okay, so, all right, so, and
Counties.
Counties, okay, which is Will County? A Maxi, are you related to all the Maxis?
You never did that.
At the Tribune, I knew I met the Maxis.
Depends on which ones you know.
They're all the good ones. I guess I'm not,
They are the good ones, the farming ones, right?
yes,
There you go.
Keith Maxi is who comes to mind.
Yeah.
Well, that's my dad's.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Here we go then. Anybody else? Did I miss anybody kind of representation wise? Okay, I think I have an idea. Keep. I mean, I assume the arrow is the clicky.
Yeah,
sure. There it goes. Okay. Oh, boy. All right. So I'm taking this all the way back, Greeley and Weld County, both will recognize, Horace Greeley here. But so I want to set this stage in a pretty basic way, and I may be treading over ground that you have already road here, but, I just want to make sure we are all on the same page for our discussion. So all the way back to, our water law system here in Colorado is the Colorado Doctrine. It's unique. It's the only one in the United States. I haven't studied whether it's the only one in the world. I'm probably not going to get around to that. But this is a unique water law system, and its backbone is the priority system. So you probably have heard first in time, first in right. Whoever puts the water to the beneficial use first gets their place in line when the water is coming down. And even before, when we're trying to, all our predecessors were trying to figure out how to make things work here in Colorado. Most of the states were under a riparian doctrine, which meant you only get to use the water if you have property right next to a waterway, a river, a stream, whatever. Obviously in Colorado, that wasn't gonna work because this is the arid West. We don't have a lot of natural streams that just deliver water naturally to a bunch of very, to all of the irrigated acreage anyway. And so, as Mr. Greeley put it, he said, we seem to have reached the acme of barrenness and desolation. Wood and water fail, and we are in a desert indeed. So it sounds like a great place to settle down, set up shop. We're doing great. But truly what people did to establish the water system that we have now, particularly in northern Colorado, is extraordinary. This is what they started with. Nothing, no water. So water rights, generally speaking, I know you all know this, sorry. It's a usufructory right. I hate that word. But it just means the really hard way to say, you have the right to use the water for a specific purpose, in a specific location, at a specific time, in a specific amount. It's a really hard conversation that we have with quite a few of our clients about owning water. You don't own it unless you don't own water. You have the right to use it, but if you don't use it, you may in fact lose it. So we have a lot of abandonment conversations with clients. It's a tough one. And so a water right is perfected by beneficial use. So you divert the water, put it to irrigation. I'm just going to use irrigation a lot as an example. Put it to irrigation use on your farm, and you've perfected a water right. Now, if you want to protect your water right, and you want to demand that it be delivered to you, or that someone is injuring you, you have to adjudicate that water right in water court. And that's where you get your place in line in the priority system. Water rights are real property interest. Many of you have probably been involved in buying, selling for your respective entities or, so the nice thing about water rights is they can be sold irrespective of the land. So you can sell your land, keep the water, keep your land, sell the water. Most often, or the most common water right, at least in our area, is a share in a mutual ditch company. And so what you own there is a portion of a water right that's owned overall by all of the shareholders in a mutual ditch company. It's not terribly common to have just sort of your own ditch water right. And if you do, it's likely that's a pretty junior water right. That's a good question. Yeah, questions are welcome, by the way.
A lot of the water rights, like especially in agriculture, are they already adjudicated or are many of them not adjudicated?
So most of them are adjudicated, especially the really old, and I call them the good ones, because they're the ones that have the high priorities, meaning like 1870s, 1860s, on their respective tributary rivers. And so, yeah, most of those went through, and I'll go through a couple of so what used to happen was they would go through a general adjudication. So everybody who was claiming the right to divert water for their respective farm, or for their ditch as a group of farmers under a ditch company, they would all file an application to a district court. We didn't have water courts back then. And then the district court would kind of get everybody together, sort everybody out, and then come up with a priority list. And that would be a general adjudication decree. And so a lot of these older decrees are that type of general adjudication where everybody got together, figured out where they fit in the priority system. And that was the rule moving forward. So, and I should say a decree, a water right is typically represented by a decree. And so most of the time for some of the newer decrees, you'll have your own individual decree for a specific ditch company, something like that, or a reservoir. But back in these general adjudications, they were just this big, long, 1,000-page document where you'd have to find there's my ditch, and then I go down to page whatever and find your water right. So,
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up?
oh, sure.
Are those based on consumptive water use?
Oh, ooh, that's a good question. Okay, so no, that's based on diversion.
Okay.
So so when those ditch companies let's go to like 1890, I think was one of the first general adjudications. I'm really bad with the years. But so let's go back all the way to that. The claim was we have dug our ditch, we have diverted water through our ditch, and the farmers under our ditch have put it to beneficial use. And so that was the claim that you're making. The historical consumptive use comes into play when you want to change a water right from irrigation use to another use, which is, that's typically what a change case is going to be, because and I'll kind of talk about why, but all of the senior priority rights are originated in irrigation and were ditch company diversion and adjudication. Yeah, keep the questions coming, honestly. I don't want to touch on talking at you. So I guess maybe another thing I should do is explain sort of what water lawyers do, because when I say that I'm a water attorney, I usually get like blank stares back or the phone line goes a little quiet. So in water court, which is, I would say I spent probably about half my time working on cases in water court. So we help obtain water rights, we help perfect conditional water rights, and we help our clients who have water rights protect the ones that they have against new filings. The other half, I would say, is these two things, transactions and water structures. So transactions, we're helping people purchase water rights, people sell water rights, and then leasing water rights is another big transaction that we deal with. So a lot of agreement drafting. And water rights often have, we like to see them have their own deeds in any transaction. So whether it's a piece of the general deed that, that we like to see that specific language, magic language, or it's a separate deed, we're preparing those. And then with regard to water structures, we'll get into all of the systems that we have here in Northern Colorado, the big ditch systems, reservoir systems, so delivery and storage structures. But it turns out that, so all of these systems are, they're really incredible and long and very complex. And landowners who have ditches on their property, especially when they learn, like they purchase a property and they learn for the first time there's a ditch on their property, there's a lot of conflict there when it comes to, oh, someone has the right to come onto my property and maintain their ditch. And that right to maintain is a statutory now right, which that statute's relatively new, but it's pretty clear, but it's typically a difficult conversation to have. So we do some litigation and around the use of private ditches and reservoirs, and then also easements for those structures. That's what I do. Yes.
So like groundwater wells, people are getting their water from the groundwater well, does that require adjudication as well, or is it a different process?
It doesn't require adjudication. So I guess, and I can kind of just high level this and we'll see how much time we want to spend on this. But so ditches in Colorado were the first water structures, then reservoirs. And then it was almost like, oops, we forgot about groundwater. And I'm not saying that to, say that they weren't thinking things through. Well, I mean, this is an evolving system and these are evolving issues, but especially the further you get from a tributary particularly, you need wells, groundwater wells. And so then we had the Groundwater Management Act that came after after the 1969 Act. That's probably not right. But anyway, after all the reservoirs and ditches have been established. And so typically, because your groundwater right, so I guess maybe to answer your question, if you wanted to go drill a well right now and get a groundwater right, it wouldn't really do you a lot of good to go to water court and adjudicate that well, because what you're gonna have to do is augment that well. You're gonna have to get it into an augmentation plan. And so if you're lucky enough to be able to add that well to an existing augmentation plan, you might be okay there, but again, you're not gonna adjudicate it, you just need a permit. So that's an administrative process for wells. And back in the day, there were a lot of decrees for wells. So they kind of followed the same process, but that, to me, it sort of seems like they still kind of had a chance in the priority system, but a 2023 right has basically no chance of, calling out another water right or something like that in the priority system because it's already so established, so.
So basically, if so one of my friends just built a house, they had to drill a well to get there by Carter Lake, right? It's like a 700-foot well, so if that well ever goes dry, right? They're screwed, like. Or they don't from there, and they're they required it there, right? So.
Right, so, and that may be, so there are two different types of wells. There's the big old well for irrigation purposes that you're gonna be using a lot of water. I mean, maybe you want 100 acre feet a year. What?
Center pivots.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that's actually the ideal way to fuel or to deliver water through pivots as well, because direct flow, you can't use all the water at once, so you gotta stop it up somehow, right? So, there's those irrigation wells, and those are the ones that I'm talking about that doesn't really matter if you have a priority on those, you're just gonna have to add it to an augmentation plan for that type of big use. Now, maybe the well that your friend was talking about or has obtained is a exempt well, meaning they're so small, they're for domestic purposes, very limited outdoor irrigation, like maybe a nice lawn, and then you can water your personal donkeys or whatever you have, but that's it. Those are exempt because they're really considered so small an amount in terms of any tax that they have on the river system. And so through the exempt well process, you don't have to adjudicate. You would just go get a permit for that. Now, with all of that said, if you think for some reason you're going to want to, or you're going to need to protect that water right in some way, maybe against neighbors, maybe that, then you do want to adjudicate it, even an exempt well, to establish that water right. But for the most part, we tell people that it's really not worth it to go through that process for those purposes. Yeah.
Just augmentation.
Yeah. Yay. Oh, man. Okay, so
Sorry.
no, not at all. It's just it's a difficult concept, even for me. So essentially, I'll use a well as an example because that's the best one. So you're pumping your well, say you're a mile from the river. You're pumping your well, you're using it for, let's say, irrigation. So let's say it's one of those big ones that's actually, depleting quite a bit. The amount of water that you take up through that well is presumed to be headed to the river. It's on the way to the river, but you're now diverting it. So you're impacting what water would typically go down the river by diverting it up to the surface. And so what we have is this process through which we have engineers, I would never even dream of these calculations, but these calculations can determine when that water that you diverted up through your well would have made it to the river And then the augmentation is you replacing that water. It's sort of a misnomer in a lot of ways, because you're really replacing what you're taking away from the river by diverting it through a well.
And that can, there are different, like, some people will pull water from a well and irrigate in the summer for their crops, and then maybe they augment in the winter when there's not as much demand on the river, but they're still replacing that water, but it's at a different time. Essential.
Sure, and that's a good point too, sorry, so it's the timing that's really difficult, and it's a calculation, obviously, we don't know how fast or slowly that water would have come back to the river, but it's a timing issue, so you pump in July or August, and your depletions may hit the river in December or January, so that's the time when you need to have a replacement source back at the river to basically make sure that the river doesn't feel depleted because of that pumping that occurred back in July. So that's another difficult aspect of it, is figuring out the timing and the location. Where would your well water have hit the river had you not diverted it?
Let me just do a little more. So this is really a hydrologic, very complex thing that goes on. So you've got alluvial aquifers, which is what we're talking about, which are, it's the groundwater table that is connected to the surface water. And so any groundwater that's near streams and rivers, that is eventually going to end up as surface water in your stream. And our system is such, especially the South Platte River Basin, where we talked about this a little bit, I think, the return flows are critical, and they're used over and over in the system again. So a farmer pulls water out of the river, he irrigates, that water goes back into the ground, it goes back into the river. Some of it is used by the plant, but some goes back in the river, and the next farmer uses it, and so on until it gets to Nebraska. But if you are pulling that water from the groundwater and you don't have an augmentation plan and you're a lower priority right, you have to replace that water rights. And this came about, people didn't necessarily understand, or it wasn't part of the water rights system until there was a huge boom in these groundwater wells. So we had the Dust Bowl, the 1930s drought, the surface waters were dried up. People started putting in groundwater wells and started pumping like crazy. And then in the 50s, there was another drought, and all of a sudden you have these surface water diverters saying, hey, where is our water? Where's my senior water right? And it's because all these groundwater wells were pulling water out, and there's all these studies done, and that's when the Groundwater Management Act came into being. And it essentially said, it brought groundwater into the water rights system and said, okay, this is, we have to be aware of the impacts of groundwater on the surface water rights, and it has to be accounted for through this augmentation plan and stuff. So it is complicated, and a lot of states still don't even have that aspect of groundwater management. So we are, I think, considered like kind of ahead of the game in terms of how we deal with groundwater management. And then the other thing I'll just mention is that you have groundwater, you have aquifer systems that are not tied to the streams and rivers. So those are called, I think, bedrock aquifers. And those are ones that are, very deep in the ground. They are considered more like, you have to, the restrictions on pumping those are much more severe because they're not being replaced as quickly. It takes 100 or 1,000 years to replace the water. You think of the Ogallala aquifer. So if you pump all that water out, it's just gonna be gone until 1,000 years later, right? So, and that's where there was a lot of issues with some of the Denver Basin groundwater pumping stuff. Okay, sorry.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think you just did my job for me. So,
Hey, Whitney,
yeah.
just want to make sure I understand correctly, the example you used, the wells. With that augmentation requirement, is that only required for not non-tributary water, or is there some sort of augmentation requirement for non-tributary groundwater as well?
Okay, great. Yes, that's what she was talking about. So perfect. Let's bring that all around. And I was going to say, so your well water, your groundwater right that you want to get right now is presumed to be tributary to your river system. Just like she said, it's going to be presumed to eventually make it back to the surface. So some senior diverter really wants that water and has the right to it. So, however, if you can prove, and there are several water court cases pending right now, one that just finished and is on the way up to the Supreme Court. But there are quite a few claims, where the applicant is claiming non-tributary water, right? So they have a high burden to prove that whatever water they're diverting is in an isolated aquifer, doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the surface water system. And in that instance, if you can prove that, it's a high burden of proof. But if you can prove that as the applicant, then no, you do not have to augment it. So that's the golden ticket, right? So we have some, particularly some developments here coming online in Fort Collins that are seeking that type of groundwater right, in water court adjudication. And so, that's something that's been, I would say, I mean, Greeley's done it. They've gone through that process. I think anyone that's sitting here has probably heard someone complain about that process. And so, but I think it's relatively in the life of our water system, relatively recent to try to do something like that. So yes, if you can prove that, you're good. Otherwise, you have to augment.
The augmentation plan, you might have to go out and buy some more water.
Right,
I
and
mean, there's the rub. You gotta go buy water.
where's your augmentation water coming from?
Yeah.
Right, that's the issue.
They're right somewhere.
Right, and then in order to have an augmentation plan, and this was an issue with the big, I cannot remember the name of the well, gas. Groundwater appropriators of the South Platte, they had a big system where they would have wells, and they basically had communicated with the division engineer that their pumping would be replaced by these other surface water rights. So they basically had just worked out an adjudicative system where the wells pumping groundwater, those were replaced with surface water, and everybody was pretty much happy. However, that type of augmentation was never adjudicated. And so there's a big water court case that said, nope, that's not good enough. You have to go to water court and adjudicate your augmentation plan. And that means the water court and all the other parties get in there and make sure that what you're saying in terms of making replacements, and augmenting the water you're depleting is in fact accurate, or as close as we can get. So now you have to go to water court for an augmentation plan. I would say, I have people who call and say, I want to irrigate 10 acres. Can I get a well and then get an augmentation plan? And what we say is that's typically cost prohibitive for individuals to do something like that because of the cost of obtaining another source to augment. If you can, if you can get the ditch share, it's gonna be a lot of money, and then you have to go through water court. So. Yeah.
You know, it's probably quick, quite the water structure there. You mentioned that, the landowner has to give the ditch company, let's say, right of way to get in to maintain the ditches. If the ditch overflows or something happens to the ditch and it floods a house or something, are the ditch company liable for the damages?
True lawyer answer here, it depends. Depends on the circumstance. I can give you a couple circumstances. So statutorily, the ditch company has both the right and the obligation to maintain a ditch on private property. So if the ditch company was negligent and failing to properly maintain that ditch on that property, and that's the reason for the flooding, then you have a case to say the ditch company has to pay and they are liable. However, if they were conducting regular, reasonable maintenance on that ditch, and it was sort of an act of nature that occurred that caused the flood, then the ditch company wouldn't be liable. You're gonna probably be in court to fight about
I was gonna say,
that.
it's a 100-year flood, 100-year rainfall,
Mhm.
and the ditch was 3 feet deep, let's say, and 3 feet wide. If you made it 5 feet deep, I'd be okay. You're big because you didn't anticipate a high water level. So it'll flood. I don't know where this.
Sure, I mean, that's the argument, right? And then as the ditch company, I would say, well, I only have this much water that I'm entitled to. This is how much I typically divert, and this was something beyond what I'm responsible for. Is what I would argue. Yeah, sorry, what?
There's no clear answer.
No, it would be very circumstantial. Yeah, it would be, but I think a circumstance like that is probably one where you would find yourself in court if you can't work it out. So our firm represents, a lot of ditch companies and some municipalities as well. And so we're kind of on the both sides of the water, transactions. Yeah, so we deal a lot in what a ditch company can and can't do. So it gets messy. And usually, I mean, the best practice is just try to work something out. You tell our ditch companies to try to work with landowners because you're married, basically. So figure it out. Sure. Okay, let's see, we've covered, well, someone please tell me when, my time is, like, when we're getting to the questions time, because I'll just shut up. And we can talk.
Some questions are happening.
Yeah, I like it, keep them coming. I also should say that if I'm doing this new thing where if I don't know the answer to a question, I won't just make it up. So, I can
That's
supplement
not
them.
very lawyerly.
It is. No, but I can, if there's a question that I can't answer, I'm happy to provide some additional materials if I know of them. It just like, it probably goes to sleep, like the sound of my voice. You're not motion activated. So that's what you did, there we go. Okay. Well, so I just wanted to talk, I mean, we've done a pretty good job already of kind of getting to some of the nitty gritty of water law, but I wanted to talk just generally speaking about how we got where we are here in Northern Colorado with water rights, and then where we're headed, some of the issues that we're seeing coming down the pipeline. Okay, so I'm not gonna spend a ton of time because I think we all understand what happened here, but like I said, the ditch systems were first in being established because the people who came here and wanted to settle and irrigate crops realized very quickly that if they weren't along a river or a stream, they're out of luck. So now we're gonna start diverting water and building these giant ditch systems. And for the most part, these ditch systems were a bunch of irrigators working together who had sort of a common like geographic location or something like that. They're all working together to try to get something like this done because digging a ditch of this magnitude from, the river down to Greeley, for instance, it was just an impossible task. So they had to all get together and work on it and pay for it. So that's another reason why I just don't see like individual ditch rights very much. If they are, they're pretty junior and pretty small. But again, this is just back to the idea that that's what we had to do. And honestly, if Horace Greeley had seen the last year in terms of precipitation, he would have been like, oh, good, we're fine. It's just been a really wet year. But those are the abnormal years, right? So the general adjudication I was talking about, this one is 1882 for the Cashlaputa River. And this diagram, I think these are just really kind of fun, just because obviously that's not what the ditches look like. But these indicate where the ditches divert from the Cashlaputa River. Again, obviously the Cashlaputa River isn't straight, but it indicates where those ditches divert and then what their priority is. And this is not a good enough copy to be reading off those ditches. But so for the Cashlaputa River, for instance, we refer to them as the big four. We've got New Cache, that runs the Greeley number 2 canal. Larimer and Weld runs the Larimer and Weld canal. They deliver water in Larimer and Weld. The Water Supply and Storage Company, they have some high mountain diversions. Their system is really big. They have some high mountain I'll talk about trans mountain diversions, a lot of storage, really big system, goes all the way out to Eaton, I think. And then North Cooter is kind of in the northern part of Larimer County, and I think maybe Wells. I'm not saying that these guys get points for like originality in naming their ditch companies, but they're helpful for us to understand. So these are the seniors. These are the ones that if you can get shares in these ditch companies, those are the ones you want to be able to change. You probably don't want another price tag on most of those individual shares.
Do some of the other common ditches, like in Fort Collins, fall under those? New Mercer and Jackson?
Yeah,
Okay,
in priority.
how does that work? Just use one as an example, I guess.
Sure. Do you need, so priority wise?
Do they fall under those bigger? are they
Oh, I
sub-
think they are
they
part of
sub-
those
Yeah,
systems.
part of the system.
No, those are, so that New Mercer's its own system. Jackson Ditch is under Water Supply and Storage Company system.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's hit or miss, and even I forget which systems are under which. And then you also have laterals that are off of the main ditches, which some of those are huge and bigger than some of the smaller ditches, so.
They're still part of the ditch.
Right, so laterals are typically, not owned or controlled by the ditch company. But, and that's a fun discussion to have with shareholders sometimes is, hey, you guys sort it down, like we deliver it to the lateral head gate. The ditch company is not gonna be responsible for whatever happens below that head gate. We're not gonna get into neighbor fight. So that's another source of tension oftentimes.
So who owns the water or the land?
Whoever the shareholders are and the ditch company. Right, the ditch company delivers the water rights, the ditch company, all the shareholders as a unit own the water rights. And then depending on how many shares they have, that entitles to them to a portion of that water right. But as far as ownership of this, so, and then the shareholders also share ownership in the main structure, the main ditch. But when you get into these laterals, then it's the shareholders, it's still, you know, Water Supply and Storage Company water, for instance. But the shareholders are gonna be on the hook for whatever happens on that lateral.
You probably can get there because laying the foundation ditches, and earlier you said for adjudication ditches, reservoirs, and then groundwater, so you might get here, but. So a ditch like I'm thinking about close to Kersey, which is the Latham, that would be under the reservoir system then and not this river system, or?
So the Latham's on the South Platte, right? Yes, Latham's on the South Platte. They also have a ditch. They have a ditch priority and then they have a reservoir priority. So, yeah, and that's, so a lot of these systems also have, like I said, the Water Supply and Storage Company has a bunch of reservoirs. I can't even remember all of them. New Cache has the Cache Laputa Reservoir, so Timnath Reservoir is owned by New Cache. There's sort of sister companies that may own a ditch company and or a ditch and a reservoir, but they're all the same water. North Pluto has a bunch of storage. But yeah, so what they did was, I mean, generally speaking, this is oversimplifying horribly, but okay, we got our ditches, we can get the water down here. Well, now we have a timing issue. So, oh, and I just want to mention too, you know, the people who, and this is mostly the Water Supply and Storage Company, Michigan Ditch, I think Fort Collins has now. But I mean, these were huge undertakings to build these high mountain ditches that diverted water from other watersheds. And that water, the Colorado Big Thompson project, which I'll touch on too, because I just can't not talk about it. But that's on the Big Thompson River. That, you know, project, that water is as magical as it gets, right? In terms of the use and what you can do with it and where you can use it. It's really, really flexible. And then when you're diverting Trans Mountain water, because you're taking it from a watershed where it was historically, you know, would have gone naturally, but now you're pulling it over here, you don't have those return flow obligations. So if you're, you can just use it and reuse the water until it's gone, because you don't have to account for the idea that that water had gone onto a farm and had seeped down into the groundwater and come back up in the stream 6 months later or whatever. So that's the benefit of Trans Mountain water. So any system that has an aspect of Trans Mountain water, Water Supply and Storage Company, obviously it's EDT projects and Northern Water. And then North Cooter Irrigation has some shares in the Water Supply and Storage Company, so they have CDT too. So anyway, any system that has that aspect is really valuable as well. Okay, so storage, yes, I am here. So we have our ditches, we can get the water here, but now we have a timing issue in terms of, well, the water's gonna come down when the snow melts. And we can't use it all when it's all coming down that fast, first of all, because maybe our crops aren't ready for irrigation yet. Or, I mean, even if they were, we couldn't use that amount all at once. So now we need to find a way to time the water and stop it up and store it in a way that we can use it throughout the irrigation season. And if you're a municipality, you want to use it year round. So you want to be able to store it and have access to that when it's coming down for later use. And so that's when all these reservoirs came online. That's when it came online, but were adjudicated. So now you have to have a water right for these reservoirs as well.
And they were first adjudicated in 1994.
So this civil action, yeah, this general adjudication, I did not leave myself any notes on this one. This must have been the Cashlapuder general adjudication for these structures. I think I did a bad job of taking notes on this one, but, this may have been the Big Thompson general adjudication as well. So around that time is when we're, having those general adjudications this time for reservoirs. So now another judge is really busy. Okay, CBT. I'm actually not like an expert on CBT.
We're having Northern Water talk all about it.
Wonderful. Okay, good. You just listen to them.
Yeah.
But this project is just a monster in terms of the undertaking, the creativity that happened, the system in terms of its flexibility, in terms like diversion timing to storage. I mean, it's truly an extraordinary project. And like I said, and it's kind of as magical as we get in terms of water rights because it's really freely transferable. It can be used in Northern Water's service area, which is huge and growing. And so maybe not so fast anymore, but so yeah, I'll let them talk about that. But that's just, I mean, it's a huge part of our Northern Colorado water for sure. Okay, and then as we talked about, oh yeah, what about wells? We got to get them in the priority system somehow. And so what they determined, right, was, okay, you can have wells, but if they're going to injure a senior, which we assume they are, you're going to have to augment them. And so that's why we have augmentation plans now. And I mean, to be like digging wells in the old days was not easy either. Not quite digging a ditch, but it's also not easy. Okay, so, you know, just generally speaking, moving as times started changing, like we started off with basically like we have domestic uses and agricultural irrigation and livestock watering, right? So we have some really agricultural based water needs. But cities grew, industrial needs grew. And now finally, we're starting to take into account the environmental needs that we have and trying to maintain the health of our rivers so we can continue using them and not just destroy them. So this is where it all gets really complicated. So I'll make it really confusing for you. And then I think you're the ones that are gonna have to figure it out. Will help, but so this is in 1968, and this is just a case. I think this was Bell Power, so it may have been the well water rights case I was talking about. But so basically, this is just recognition that we are turning a page here from just really basic agricultural needs to all of these different needs that we have for water and how we are going to best put the water that we have to good uses. And so we all have enough. And I mean, that's the big question is how does everyone have water for what they need within the priority system? So this is 2015, so it's a long time ago. But, I mean, so at that point, even it was still vast majority of agricultural irrigation needs, right? So I'm sure this looks pretty different today, but maybe not that much. I mean, we still have the vast majority of water rights are in agriculture. And so, yeah, so how do we use water for these other purposes when it's all been established to be used for irrigation purposes? And, you know, so municipality representatives here, I'm sure you have either been involved in or heard of someone complaining about a change case. They can drag on for years. They're so expensive. You know, you have us doing the legal work and you have engineers doing the work that it takes to prove that by changing this water right from agricultural irrigation to municipal uses, you're not hurting the river. You're not hurting other water rights. And that takes a lot of math that I'm just not willing to do. But So it's a big process, but that's how we do it, right? We take for the most part, the good water rights, like I was saying, are from irrigation. So that's what you're changing the use from irrigation to municipal. And you're changing, all those other things that come with a water right, that define the water right. You're changing the timing, the location. You're not changing the amount, that's not okay, but, and the type of use. So you have to prove that all of those things are not gonna injure anyone else. So this is truly extraordinary in Colorado, our water court system. So in any other state, and so Idaho, for instance, grew up on a farm, dad had water rates. When he wanted to establish his water rate and confirm it, he just went to the state engineer. And it was an administrative process. But here in Colorado, obviously, you have to go to water court to establish a water right. So we have special courts just for those purposes. So in Division 1, for instance, our water court, the water judge has historically been also a division court judge. But being that water cases are growing in number, that judge typically has to just focus on water rights and maybe can take on a few other types of cases. But that's really going to be that judge's area, thanks to all of us filing applications and those sorts of things.
Is that a federal district judge or?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, good question. Ooh, so there are judicial districts and it's Colorado. So established under the Colorado Constitution, there are judicial districts. There's at least 19 of them because there's more than that, but I know that because Greeley is the 19th judicial district. Anyway, so that's the judicial district for if you're going to bring a complaint, civil action in court or something like that. And then the water courts, though, are not divided in the same way that the district courts are, the judicial districts are. So, Water Division 1, the way that these are established is based on the watershed. So Division 1 is the South Platte. So basically anything that has to do with the South Platte, we're going to Greeley. Our firm doesn't really practice much in other divisions. Division 1 is the biggest, the busiest, has the most fights. And so, we really don't have the wherewithal to go elsewhere, but obviously there are other divisions. It's really interesting to see how different the divisions deal with issues. So obviously we have general water law, right? Those are the basics, those are the fundamentals, but sort of procedurally and it's just interesting to see the differences between those water divisions. So we just sort of have our way of doing things in Division 1 that we all kind of just follow. So just real quick, it's an application to the water court. It's a specific filing. You're not, it's the same as if you would file a civil action. So you're filing it the same with the 19th judicial district. But it's going to go directly to the water judge. And then when you file an application, the water judge refers it immediately down to the water referee. And water referee, he's exactly what he sounds like. So I'm just talking about Division 1, but our referee here, so his job is essentially to try to help you work through any preliminary issues with your application with the opposers. And opposers are basically anyone who wants to file a statement of opposition who may have some kind of concern with with your application. And so there's a really low bar for what anyone can file a statement of opposition. So on the referee's docket, you're there for 18 months and you have a chance to sort of work out informally things with the opposers as the applicant. The referee statutorily has pretty broad power to kind of help you work things out. In Water Division 1, I don't see a lot of him getting into the kind of background discussions or really getting terribly involved in the issues. But I think in the earlier days of this system, I think he definitely was more involved in that process and trying to help people settle. So kind of a mediator, but a referee is a funnier word for it. So
But, so is he an engineer or an attorney or a
So-
mediator, or is it one person?
it is one person, the referee, so that you have the water judge, we actually have 2 water judges in Division 1, the main water judge and then we call him the backup, that's not right. Oh man, I can't remember the name, but we have 2 water. And so the referee though is one person, and he is, in this instance, I don't think it's a requirement or anything like that, but in this instance, he is an engineer and an attorney. And so he has both of those. Technically, yeah, so he's really great. He's been there for a very long time. So he really, that's what we hope for, is someone who can understand both the technical and legal side of things. But again, we kind of just fight in the dark in the back and then come out and say, either we can figure this out or we can't. And if we can't, we go up to the water judge.
And the water judge, and if you don't agree, can you appeal to the Supreme Court? You may have the final say, or?
Yeah, it's actually a really cool system, where water rights, I think by statute, that makes sense. So for water court though, it's a direct appeal to the Colorado Supreme Court. So rather than having to go to the Court of Appeals and, have 3 judges, panel decide, and then if we don't like that, we appeal it up. So we go straight to the Supreme Court. And so that's a really interesting process.
So how many cases actually make it there? Because there's a lot of cases filed across the state. How many cases would you say the Supreme Court actually, Colorado Supreme Court looks at? Just a swag.
3 a year, maybe.
Yeah.
And the filings are
Thousands.
thousands.
Yeah. So your likelihood of appeal, you can get this de minimis at best, right?
Right, and I think that stems from the idea that most vast,
Correct.
right, yeah, mass.
Fact findings done at the districts, and that's what they're relying on.
Yeah, and so for the most part, though, I will say that the vast majority of decrees, once I file an application, your goal is to get a decree.
Right.
It's a change case, right? So you want to change a decree that authorizes you to change this water, right? The vast majority of those decrees are settlements.
With the referee.
Not necessarily with the referee. Sometimes we figure it out on the referee docket. Sometimes we're on the water court's docket, which means there's just added pressure of like formal disclosures, and now you're doing depositions and it's getting really ugly. And, but in the midst of all that, we're still trying to settle, and the vast majority of cases settle, and you can't appeal a settlement to the Colorado Supreme Court. Yeah, so, because everybody's agreed, and so what is it? So it's only the cases that actually go to trial that are appealed. So last year, there was one that's going, well, so sorry, 2023. The trial was in April. And we're going to the Supreme Court. Yeah, so that one case this year that I'm aware of. And so that's just Division 1, too. So there are others. But yeah, only a handful.
Can I just ask, are you done with your presentation? No.
No, but did I get everything that everyone cares about? Probably.
Okay, so we have about 8 minutes for questions.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, let's start with questions then. I think this is good enough. You guys know enough now.
So one of the things I've always heard about Colorado water law was it was kind of born out of this ethos of do it yourself and fix it yourself. So frankly, the feds don't get involved. And so trying to keep it internal and in-house. And the system you're describing seems to be kind of born out of that ethos of, look, we're gonna fix it on our own. Kind of more informally than like a traditional legal system, like on the criminal side of things, like with this referee system and everything settles, that type of thing. Is that a fair thing to say? It's kind of was born of that ethos, or is that incorrect?
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about it that way. I haven't heard that, but I like that concept. I think, as is true for every state, we try to keep the feds out of as much as we possibly can.
Sure.
You probably are aware of all the Colorado River contract, and so all of those things, those were basically forced. We were forced to get along on those, and by the federal government, right? But for the most part, yes, this is Colorado's system. We get to do this on our own. We get to come up with something that works for us. And we get to handle things on our own without having the federal government get involved.
How do other states like Wyoming or, you know, other states, the same situation, water shortage, do they have water courts too, water law, or this unique to Colorado?
This is unique to Colorado. If you talked to someone in Wyoming about an augmentation plan, they probably would.
Yeah.
Not what we're talking about. Sure. But, so, yeah, Wyoming, for instance, is an administrative state, meaning there's a state engineer, they figure everything out. People still fight, so there's still court, but there isn't a specific water court. It's just a different type of, and it's more, you know, when you have an administrative system, it's more dependent on what that particular administrator, you know, or administration thinks, right? So it's less, I think anyway, less certain in that regard. And then, yeah, there definitely is a spirit of settlement among water users because, you know, the water bar, I would say, having been a member of it for only 5 years, it's very amicable, very cordial, very, like, we're pretty nice to each other for the most part. And I think it's because we all have the same issues and we all rely on the same sources. And so it really doesn't make sense to just, you know, beat up on someone in water court unless you absolutely have to. Like, there's an injury you have to prevent. But even then, I mean, we're still pretty cordial about it. And so I think it's getting more litigious. I think we're probably going to see more water trials moving forward, just because more needs and the same amount or less water moving forward. So.
How much work are you doing on the market side of things? So you've talked a lot about like establishing rights from a legal perspective, but as far as the proverbial stock market, the horse trading that goes on, and water rights and all of that, how much does that enter into your law practice?
We only see it and refer it immediately to someone who knows the answer to that question.
Okay.
We don't deal, I mean, we know typically we have a pulse on most of our clients, for instance, what their shares, you know, are going for in the market. We typically understand, and I wouldn't dare off the top of my head, but like CBT units, what those are going for. We have some kind of pulse on that, but we don't deal in that. Really, we just try to get some, there are specific appraisers for water rights, for instance. They're sort of few and far between now, but I think they're probably going to be more coming along.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about that, and John Tracy, last time we met, talking about the speculative purchase acquisition of water, and is that a beneficial use? Has that been adjudicated? Has that been defined with the storage of, you know, municipalities by water and speculation of growth 50 years from now? So is that a beneficial use, and is that been answered?
So municipalities are special. We have the Great and Growing Cities Doctrine in Colorado, meaning we do give municipalities time to establish their water resources, set up their water system, make sure that they have a robust enough system to meet the growing needs as they're coming down, you know, in 50 years, right? Now, whether there's a definition of a time period that's reasonable, there's one case and it says 50 years, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And so that's something I think that's up for argument. You know, what is 100 years planning speculative? I don't, you know, I think the speculation that most people are worried about is those who don't plan to put the water to beneficial use, but just want to have it as an asset, particularly entities that may be from out of state, not really knowing, just hearing that owning a share in such and such is, you know, worth $1 million. So, you know, it's a good investment, right? That's the kind of stuff that I think we're worried about. You know, at least from my perspective and what we see in our office as concerns. We want to give municipalities time to grow, you know, to plan for the growth ahead of time, for sure.
And what was that called, the Colorado?
The Great and Growing Cities Doctrine. Can't remember the case. Sorry.
And can I just follow up with a question? Is it true? I thought I read somewhere that in the current appropriations doctrine, speculation is considered not, it's like specifically not a beneficial use. So for the purpose of acquiring it for an asset, for example, it's not.
Right. Right, you only have a water right if you put it to beneficial use. Our beneficial uses are pretty well figured out by now. Yeah, you can't just buy a water right with the hopes that you can sell it down the line, with no use attached to it. So that's one really, really basic part of our system here, that you only are able to use the water if you can put it to a beneficial use.
But there are plenty of water speculators, and they just lease it, they just lease the water, then
Absolutely.
it goes to beneficiary, they just lease it.
That's how they get it.
It generates some income, get around the speculation because they're leasing it to farmers or, you know.
Sure, so what we typically see now, and we do see a lot of pushback on it, in water cases now where, for instance, we are asking an applicant, okay, you're saying that you want to use this for augmentation purposes, but you don't have your own augmentation plan. So can you show us a contract that you have with someone who does have an augmentation plan to show us that you will be putting this water to that beneficial use and not just using it as an investment?
Yeah.
The time's probably up. Does anything?
We're about up, but maybe you can stick around for a couple of minutes if other people have questions.
Yeah,
Because we have a break right now,
absolutely.
so.
Oh, yeah, sure. Come up and ask any questions you have, and then I'm sure, I probably didn't put it in here, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions you guys have offline. You can provide my contact information. 3/4 of the way through. That's really nice. I'd rather talk. I really would rather have a conversation, so that was great. Thank you.
Can we get copies of this,
All the presentation materials are always up on the website.
Oh, good.
Afterwards, yeah.
If you promise not to judge me for typing error, you have to promise.
God, I can read you on that errors,
Well,
send you the wrong way.
I don't know. I'm pretty good at them.
All right, so we're gonna take a quick break. We'll come back in here at 10:50 and hear more about water administration. Who do you have? We have Michael Heim
Yeah, great.
and Leader.
Team leader. Yep. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh, she's no more.
Yeah.
You read it? I got you.
Same situation. Right, right. So it's an easement on someone else's property, but have your water delivered through their land. And so you want to make sure that that's there. If someone has that but doesn't have water, that's great. You can obtain it if you want, try to buy a share in the ditch. The other thing that you want to watch for there is, if there's a delivery right, but no water rights, you want to check for dry. Because if that land has been dried up, they can't use that system. And that's, they could lease DET, but that's about it.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Questions on that? So-
Yeah, no, it's a fun topic, I think, anyway.
I do too.
No. Dennis was telling me that's why he's not. Tracy. Riding the post. I was about to do it if you have a good time there.
All right. We're gonna pick back up. Administration. So we just got the basics of water law. Now we'll hear from Michael Hine and Jean Lever. Michael Hine was born and raised in northern Colorado. He received a BS in civil engineering from Colorado State University in 1998. Joined the Colorado Division of Water Resources in 2007. For the first 4 years, he held the groundwater engineer position in the Division I Greeley office before becoming an assistant division engineer in 2010, where he held that position for over 8 years. He was appointed as the lead assistant division engineer for Water Division I in September of 2018. As the lead assistant division engineer, he assists the division engineer in all matters related to water administration in Water Division I, including ground and surface water in compliance with the South Platte River Compact Fund, Sand Creek Memorandum of Agreement between the states of Colorado and Wyoming and Sand Creek water users, and the Wyoming versus Colorado Supreme Court decision for the Laramie River and its tributaries. So Michael, thank you very much for coming and take it away.
And thank you for the introduction and thank you for having us come back again this year. It's always a pleasure for us. So thank you. With that, I'll just jump right into the slides. We are the Division of Water Resources. We are under the Department of Natural Resources for the state of Colorado. There are 8 departments and we are one of those 8. This is a quick kind of overview of our leadership. So Kevin Ryan, he is the state engineer, or also known as the director of the Division of Water Resources. And he supervises the deputy director, Tracy Kozloff, as well as the 7 division engineers, of which Corey DeAngelis is the Division I engineer, my supervisor. I'll kind of go in a little bit more detail about the divisions and how they're broken up. So our mission at the Division of Water Resources is to administer the waters of the state to maximize lawful beneficial use, ensure that dams and water wells are properly constructed and safe, and provide information about water resources to the public. A little bit more on our roles and responsibilities. So our main role is water administration, both surface and groundwater. We are also participants in water court, either through the summary of consultation process, which is a direct relationship with the water referee, as well as we can file statements of opposition in water court litigation. We are also, as mentioned in the intro, we have several interstate compacts and decrees that we administer. We have a flow measurement program, hydrographic program. So those folks in our office are responsible for measuring stream flow, which is very critical for our administration. We'll definitely get into that in more detail. But they also assist the commissioners as well with their day-to-day operations and measuring stream flow at flume diversions for head gates. We need to make sure that that diverted amount of water is accurate and reliable information, because that's very key to us. We have a well metering program. So a while ago, we formulated rules for accuracy of well meters for groundwater diversions. So we make sure that all those wells that are pumping are accurate as well. We have a dam safety program and well construction and inspection program as part of our public safety programs. We have well metering and then public data and information, and a little bit more about that at the end. So the Office of the State Engineer, actually, the Office of the State Hydraulic Engineer was created by the legislature in 1881. So kind of put a pin in that date. The State Engineer's Office became part of that Department of Natural Resources, those 8 departments, in 1969 as part of the Water Right Administration Act. And in addition to that act, it also created the water divisions and the division engineer. State engineer, he was also the director of water resources, Kevin Ryan. He's appointed by the governor, and the state engineer's office has around numbers about 267 statewide. So here it is statewide. So up in the upper right-hand corner is the Division I basin, South Platte Basin. Greeley is by statute the home office or location for the division office, as well as state engineer's office by statute is located in Denver at 1313 Sherman Street, just to the south of the Capitol. And then there are the other 7 divisions around the state. Here's a blow-up of Division I, and it's showing the district boundary maps, and the districts were developed as part of the basin delineations. So for instance, we are in District 3, which is the Poudre River Basin. So that pretty much encompasses all the tributaries and drainage areas within the Poudre Basin. And then to the west of that, we have District 48, which is the Laramie River. And then Sand Creek is District 76. And then to the far east, we have the Republican and the Rickery Basins, 65 and 49. You kind of see the states around Colorado, and notice that South Platte drains into Nebraska to the northeast. So I mentioned that the state hydraulic engineer was came to be in 1888. Notice that the water commissioner actually superseded that in 1879. And they were commissioned for the main principle of the distribution of water based on priority. So you probably heard this already, I would imagine, but just to recap real quickly, prior appropriation means those that put the water to use first are entitled to get their water first during periods of shortage. Priority of the water is determined both on the date when it was first put to beneficial use. So when you took that water out of the stream and applied it, not only is it that, but also when you go to court and get a decree. So even though you appropriate the water, you won't necessarily get a priority date until you go to court. And court is the only venue by which to do that. And then in the state constitution, it states, you know, when in statehood, water of every natural stream is hereby declared to be property of the public. And it also discusses the priority of the appropriation as being the better right as between the use of the water for the same purpose. So Water Division I, we have 2 compacts. We have the South Platte River Compact and we have the Republican River Compact. We have the U.S. Supreme Court decision, Colorado v. Wyoming, and that's for the administration of the Laramie River. Showed you that kind of in that basin, that Division I map up in the northeast corner, west corner, sorry. And then you have the interstate compact with Sand Creek. So just real quickly, the South Platte River Compact was ratified between the two states, Colorado and Nebraska, in 1923. It only impacts Water District 64. So that is essentially the western boundary of Washington County to the state line of Nebraska. That is the only bit, that was actually the reason for the creation of Water District 64. From April 1st to October 15th, the flow must be at least 120 CFS at the state line. And if it's not, then we curtail junior rights or rights junior to 1897. And even if the flow falls below 120 CFS, rights senior, which have dates that are earlier than 1897, may still be able to diverge. And then there's the other section of the compact that talks about the Perkins County Canal. So between October 16th and March 31st, Nebraska was awarded a 500 CFS right with a December 17th, 1921 appropriation date. And in order to divert that, Nebraska is planning to construct that canal. And some other considerations is we have at least one large reservoir that's senior to that, that's going to be able to store, as well as 35,000 acre feet of storage for use by Colorado is also part of that. And Colorado has complied with and remains in compliance with the compact. Laramie River Supreme Court decision. So this was amended in 1957 based on an agreement between the Meadowland users and the Trans Mountain users. And it modified the total diversion of water for Colorado's use out of the Laramie River to a little over 49,000 acre feet, of which just shy of 20,000 acre feet is used by the Trans Mountain users. So those are described up above. So that water actually goes out east through the Laramie Tunnel. And then 29,500 acre feet stays within the basin for use by those in the Laramie River Basin on the Colorado side. And then anything in excess of that goes to Wyoming. The Sand Creek Agreement is a little more simplified, I think. So when Wyoming has a demand of 40 CFS, they let Colorado know that, and we deliver such amount or lesser based on our administration. And then once we deliver that for 7 days, then it's reduced to 35. So here's what we call the snake diagram. It just gives you an idea. It's a little outdated. It's 2011, but still gives a very good overall average depiction of flows leaving the state of Colorado and those that accrue within the state. So I just want to point out that this is our Kersey gauge, as we refer to it. So it's Kersey, which is just east of Greeley. This gauge is very critical to our administration because it captures all the tributary flows coming into the South Platte River. And I just want to notice that there's quite a bit of water diverted between that gauge and what leads to go to Nebraska. So here's a map that kind of shows our water variability within the basin and what we have to deal with when we're administering water. So water is very variable and it drives our administration, it drives our calls, which we'll go into that in a little bit. But this just kind of gives you an idea of how variable it can be. So this is the South Platte, this is snow water equivalent in the South Platte Basin. So we have been as high as 25 inches and as low as just shy of 10. Last couple of years, we've been right around the median, which is this green line. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a median line right there, and we've been kind of tracing it pretty closely. And here's our rainfall that goes back to the early 1900s. It shows also quite a bit of variability. And just a couple of facts about it. You know, the South Platte River Basin is about 23,000 square miles. The river's about 400 miles in length, which makes it quite difficult when we're moving water from the upper end of the basin to the very lower end. Quite a distance. Precipitation, like we talked about, quite variable. And then we have quite a bit of elevation differential. We also get trans mountain diversions coming into Division 1. And these are diversions that originate or water from the West Slope basins. So this is the Yampa River Basin. This is the Colorado River Basin. Primarily, that's where most of those trans-mountain diversions come into Division One. So here is kind of a overall culmination of what we just presented as far as the hydrology and a little bit about our diversions within the basin. On average, about 1.4 million acre feet of water is diverted per USGS estimates of native flow. We talked about those trans-mountain diversions, bring in about 400,000 acre feet annually. But based on our diversion records, there's about 4 million acre feet of water used. So there's far more water being used than native flow and trans-mountain flow on an annual average year. Well, the reason for that is return flows. So what this map is depicting these are headgate diversions on the river, starting from Kersey all the way to the state line with Nebraska. And each one of these diversions, so you'll notice this, at this gauge right here, there was 700 CFS in the river at that time, and it dropped way down to about 200. So that means they took off the river about 500 CFS of water. And then as the river as you go downstream of the river begins to gain water. And notice here at the Jackson Lake Inlet, it takes everything that's available, which is over 300 CFS. And then again, the river essentially starts to gain a bunch of additional water. Those return flows are a result of irrigation practices. So when you put water on a field for irrigation, some of that water goes to actually grow the greening of the crop. Some of that water goes past the root zone and into the alluvium, which then flows back to the stream. So that's what's creating these return flows primarily. There's other factors, but that's the main point I wanted to make. And just to take that a little bit further, to show you the development of water rights based on those return flows. So in the early 1860s, the development of water rights occurred within the tributary basins. And then as they irrigated and used that water, created a reliable source of water. This is from Denver to Greeley on the South Platte River. This is the blue line, demarked as B. So as this became a more reliable source in the late 1860s and early 1870s, they began to appropriate water because it was a reliable source of water, and so on and so forth as it moved to the state line. So we are very much an over-appropriated basin. We have way more demand for water on pretty much every year than is available in the stream. And those shortages are generally in the summer, although we do have calls that we have in the winter time as well for reservoir storage. But primarily during the summer, we have irrigation calls on the river, and we'll talk about a call dating from the 1860s, going back to that map when they were developed in the tributaries. So that's high up in the tribs, usually an 1860 call to the lower end, down on the further end on the South Platte in the 1890s. And then one of the things to point out is, since it's over appropriated, really, if anybody wants to appropriate new water today, they need to develop a plan for augmentation to effectively divert water out of priority. And the function of that is to replace that water that they take out of priority with another source, so that those senior rights, those 1860 and 1890 rights, don't see any effect as it relates to that out of priority diversion. And out of priority means it's actually a diversion that's occurring when the priority of the call is senior to what they would normally be able to divert against. So let's talk about a call. So a call is a demand for water by a user. It's typically it's with a decreed water right. So when somebody with an 1860 water right says, I want water today, they call our water commissioners and say, okay, And usually the water commissioner knows and is in communication with them quite frequently. But just for the purposes of this discussion, they'll get a hold of the commissioner and say, hey, I need water today and actually I'm short. I need more water than is available at my head gate today. Well, then what the commissioner will go ahead and do is say, okay, I need to look at the supply and the demand in the system, not just your demand, but everybody's demand within the basin. And I need to find the point with the most junior right that I can satisfy with the supply of water, because that variability we talked about, we always don't have enough water to satisfy all calls. So we set that call with the most junior right, and then anybody that is junior to that date must curtail. And that's part of our job, is to make sure they're not diverting. And there are still periods in the basin of no call, which means there's more supply than demand. And those are generally during storm events, when we have rain events or runoff from snow melt, creates quite a bit of flow in the streams. So I talked a little bit about kind of our information and making it public. This is our Colorado Decision Support System. It's fortunately kind of hard to read. I don't know if these slides will be available, but folks will be able to see that all of our information we've tried to make available to the public. And we talked about calls. So we try to post all our active calls and our history of calls. Our station, which we'll go into in a little bit. So well permits, you can get that information. If you got a water court decree, you should be able to get that from our website. Diversion records. So if you have a water right and want to know what it's diverted or interested in that, you can pull past diversion records or diversion records online, go back to the 1950s, but we do have diversion records in our books sometimes that go back to the early 1900s. And here's our telemetry sites. So one of the things that's been very helpful and critical in our basin, especially with the over appropriation, is making sure that we have accurate information relative to what is being diverted at any time. And we have put in a lot of effort along with a lot of cooperators, Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, Lower South Platte Water Conservancy District, Central Colorado Water Conservancy District. A lot of the municipalities have been very instrumental in getting their diversions on our state website, and it's near real time. It's taking every 15 minutes, it's giving us a value of what's being diverted when they're actively taking water. So we can look at this site, not only us, but the public. This is open to anybody. Can look at what anybody's doing. Very transparent and very useful for our administration. It's actually critical. So some future considerations for our basin is we're likely going to see more changes of water right applications. There's been a steady progression since 2002 of augmentation plans. I kind of briefly talked about those as taking water out of priority and giving some other source. So we're seeing those continue, and they're getting more very complex with our administration and the provisions that are included in those decrees. We must administer those. That's something our office does. So those are still getting more and more complex. We have a lot of recreational and environmental flows. So you see the in-stream flows, recreational and channel flows, a couple new statutes that we're starting to see actually going through the water court process is the plan for augmentation down in stream flows. There's one of those proposed in the Poudre Basin. Fish and wildlife mitigation. So all of those require our office to ensure that water is getting and moving through the system to maintain these decree requirements to keep a stream flow, a wide flowing stream. So before I turn it over to Jean, just really quickly wanted to touch on the day-to-day administration of a water commissioner. We talked about the call. That's the first and foremost thing they do in the morning, every morning. usually, and sometimes twice a day. Other than that, when see a lot of a lot of storm events coming through, we try to take that peak off. So we may set a call at 8 a.m. We may change that call at noon, and we may do it again at 4. That's kind of where we kind of bounded our calls, and they're 7 days a week. Water runs 7 days a week. So we're always looking at the river. We're always assuring diversions are in priority and for decreed uses without waste. So there's always a discussion about what waste is. And waste is not what normally is normal waste coming off the end of the field. So if you're furrow irrigating with flood, you have always a little bit of water coming off the end of the field. They call that wastewater, but that's not what we consider as waste. Waste is if you're taking a diversion off the river and it's maybe considered in excess because what you're turning back at the end of your ditch is a little bit too much more water. And give us discretion on what we can consider that to be. But if we find it to be way more than it should be, then we can go to folks and say, hey, you need to turn your head gate down because you're taking too much water out the tail. So we want to make sure that that's a manageable tail amount. And that's very subjective and something that the commissioners are always looking at. There's other kinds of waste, but that's the main one. Delivery of augmentation and other water for assessing transit losses. So a lot of these augmentation plans require that they maintain return flows. So there's augmentation releases that are made to the river, and we need to monitor those. And then we assess transit loss. So the public can use the river as a conduit to move their water. But we will assess a transit loss to ensure that they're accounting for any sort of natural losses to the system. So if the river is losing water to evaporation or consumption of trees along the riverbank, this water will also, the water we're administering the delivery of, will also suffer that same loss. That's what the transit loss is. And operating exchanges. So that's when you take water out of the stream at a upstream location and return water at a downstream location. And what we want to make sure of is in that reach, nobody's injured. So that's called an exchange, where you effectively take water out of priority up here, upstream, and release a substitute supply down below. Assuring diversions are measured. We talked about our hydrographic branch. They help us with that and making sure it's not only measured, but accurately measured. Assuring augmentation and return flows are made. So it's another component of a change case or an augmentation plan. Assuring compliance with all those other decrees that I talked about, having complex terms and conditions. And then review of lots of accounting. And one of the things at the end of the year we do is we create a diversion record. I mentioned that briefly in that CDSS dashboard, but every ditch that diverts water, we have a statutory obligation to create a record of its diversions every year. And that's what the commissioners work on probably most of the winter. So with that, I don't know if we're taking questions or if I just turn it around over to Jean.
Let's take maybe a few questions and then we'll turn it over to Jean. Let's give it a call.
What's the headwater itself? Where is it?
Everywhere.
So the
it's
South
not-
Highlands,
It's Cooter, it's the Big Thompson, it's the,
Yeah, but
the South Park itself.
Yeah,
so probably South Park.
Okay.
If this is what you're talking about, when we talk about headwaters up in this area, so Park County. But you're right, exactly. We have many headwaters
oh, I
along the
see.
tributaries. So all of this is the Continental Divide. Sorry, this is the Continental Divide on the western edge.
Yeah, okay.
You mentioned, several years ago, the governor of Nebraska said he went out getting our fair share of water. People in Julesburg and elsewhere were taking, each rate and taking that. You tried to put a pipeline into Colorado to take it out before they got it. What's the status of that? Is that resolved or is that still
That is still ongoing. That is what we talked about with the Perkins County Canal. That's what that is. So there is an article in statute that allows Nebraska to divert water from a location just south of Ovid is the point of diversion. And they can take out of the river with a priority date of this 1921. So the canal has not been constructed, and I think what you're talking about is they're looking at constructing that canal.
Yeah. We're still, just unresolved.
Yeah, it's still
ongoing, basically.
They're going for it. They're going. And I saw Ethne first.
Yes.
How many water commissioners are there?
So we have a water commissioner for each basin, mostly. We do have a shared commissioner that does double duty in 9 and 80, but primarily we want, and then one in 76 and 48. And actually, there's technically one commissioner for both of these basins, I guess. But for the main basins, there's one. So Gene Lever is District 4, which is the Big Thompson. Mark Simpson is District 3, the Big Tom and the Cooter River. So yeah, usually one. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, you took the words right out of me. Yes. Yes.
You talked to one of the big arguments against this is it will increase the flows of the river and that will have an adverse effect on the river. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because it seems like you're doing so much management and there's so much more demand than there is actual water. Wouldn't that potentially be a beneficial thing?
I don't really deal much with that. I don't know if Northern is gonna present.
We'll hear from Northern next
I'll say.
session. And that will be a big point of discussion.
So I'll leave it to Northern. Once it gets administered or decreed, built, then we'll obviously administer it. Because they have a decree that's, remember right, it's like a 1980s decree, something like that, for Glade Reservoir. Yeah, so once that gets constructed, we'll be administering those diversions. And I think there's, their diversions is kind of up in that, like you said, in the headwaters of Cooter, or kind of up there by the, above the city of Fort Collins.
Maybe we'll take one more question and we'll turn it over to Gene.
You mentioned, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. You mentioned that the state has an obligation to keep 120 CFS in the plot, is that right?
Yes.
Have we ever dipped below that out of curiosity?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So when we dip below that, which happens quite often,
Okay.
by this article, all we're obligated to do is curtail diversions that are junior to 1897. And I should clarify, and I didn't in the presentation, but there are quite a few water rights that are senior to that date that still can divert. And this is obviously still confined to District 64, which this is a good map of. So here's the western boundary of Washington County. And right here, very closely, we have a gauge that we use to administer the upper reach, which is the Balzac gauge. And then down here, we have our Julesburg gauge, and this is the one we consider our state line gauge.
Right.
And this is where we have to keep 120 CFS. And if it dips below that, we place the call, and then all those rights that are junior curtail. And that's the extent of our administration. So it's a kind of unique compact where we don't then have to go find water to keep it at 120.
Okay.
It's just if it's above 120, we don't have the call on.
Sure.
So.
But evidently those senior rights probably drive, because they're not out of bounds. In essence, they keep pushing it below.
Yeah, they can keep pushing it below 120. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick. Jean is going to speak. She serves as a Big Thompson River Commissioner in District 4. She is responsible for the river's daily water distributions and maintaining water diversion records. Jean's work involves setting calls on the river, assuring diversions are in priority, and assuring augmentation and return flow requirements are met and compliance of debris. So everything that Michael just mentioned.
Okay, so Big Thompson River Commissioner, Loveland, like Estes Park, you all know where Big Thompson is. Sure. Yeah. All right. So native water and CBT water are our only sources of water. And our only non-native water is CBT water, unlike the Pooter, which has Loudermere water, Sand Creek water, just straight out Colorado River water from them. But we only have CBT water, but it's CBT water, what is called Colorado. So the flow of the Colorado River water uses the Big Thompson River to make its way to Carter and Horsetooth, and really is probably the sort of single largest way in which how this river of mine works, in fact, is in conjunction with this movement of Colorado River water. All right, so native Big Thompson water, this is not different from really any of our tributary basins. Really, we're heavily dependent on the snowmelt season, roughly 75+% of the water, the native water we have in the Thompson Basin is snowmelt runoff. Essentially, it's the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park. For all of us who live here, when you go up to Rocky Mountain National Park, it's all the stuff you're driving through, it's the river that you see there. We also have the North Fork of the Big Thompson and the Buckhorn, which can have been significant contributors, particularly this last year, I'll talk about it later on. The Little Thompson Basin is a whole world unto itself. It does not have any high reaches, it has lower elevations, so really, you know, if we look at our last number of winters where we've had not a whole lot of snow accumulation in the lower elevations, it essentially means that the flow of water in the Little Thompson is really small. I don't know how else to say, really small. Steepage, which Mike talked about when he said, you know, we have 4 million acre foot appropriated, but it's only 1,400 or 1.4 million native flows. It's the steep returns. On the Big Thompson, essentially, if you are the east of I-25 all the way down to Milliken, the vast majority of the water that you have in the river there is steep water that's come back to the river from irrigation. Part of it is actually irrigation returns that come from the Pooter, mostly irrigation from the Big Thompson, irrigation from the Little Thompson, and because this is how the Little Thompson works, irrigation from the St. Vrain. A lot of ditches on the St. Vrain tail, that's to say their excess, runs into, in fact, the Little Thompson and becomes a significant contributor to the flow in the Big Thompson down towards Johnstown and Milliken. So oddly enough, though, the steep returns flow, in fact, it makes for a relatively steady amount of water in the river. It's, you know, it's coming back all the way through the year. It's really for those guys on the bottom end of the river system, it's actually sort of a much steadier and more reliable flow year round, not that they necessarily use it. Whereas the guys who are up more towards the head end of the river deal with the much larger fluctuations of the hydrograph. Okay, so this is the Big Thompson above gauge. So in other words, if you go up to Estes Park and you have the lake there, on the west side, there's a whole bridge, and then we have a gauging station of the Big Thompson River that comes in there. This is the flows going back to the mid-1950s, peak daily flow. So a couple of things notice. 2013, we did not include the 2013 floods, because for one thing, that would just have had one value that shot literally an order of magnitude above everybody else. And the other thing I always wondered, hold on, oops, we don't have a pointy. Do we have a pointy? No, This was a really bad 20 years, back in the 1950s, 1970s. I keep meaning to think maybe I should go back and see if this is really true. You know, this was maybe the 1950s or the period we were really getting into more modern flow measurements, and perhaps that whole, 20-year period there, we were not really collecting our flow measurement data in quite the same way that we do now. This,
Look at 1976
yeah,
was the horrible Big Thompson flood, but that was all east of the Estes Park.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the same thing here, the
Same thing in
2013 was a really
2013.
bad year until we hit September, and then it maybe became a really terrible year.
So
So our average flows for this gauge is roughly 907 CFS. This is 12:45 AM. Sorry, I forgot to put it on there. Honestly, every single year, the peak comes in at roughly between about 12:30 to 2:30 in the morning. You want to see the maximum flow, go up and stand on that bridge at 12:30 to 2:30. I just can't tell you exactly what day it's going to be. So this year, we had a peak that was very close to average and roughly the same time frame. So then we go to this graph. So a couple of things here. This is a natural height. This is as close to a natural hydrograph of the Big Thompson as we can really get. The Big Thompson River is a controlled release river. That's where we talk about the Colorado River portion that moves through the river. So it is now a naturally flowing river. So in order to simulate the natural hydrograph of the river, I combined both the Big Thompson above gauge that we were talking about and the flow from the North Fork. And I combined them together to get what is probably the closest thing to the natural hydrograph. It has the characteristics that you see for any of our rivers, tributary rivers here. Cooter, St. Vrain, Boulder, whatever. It's the same shape of flow, which is namely that we have 70 to 75% of the water essentially occurs in a 3-month period, mid-May to mid-August. We have really a 6-month period of the year starting roughly right now, mid-October, all the way through mid-April, which when you sum together only turns out to be about 10% of the total flow of the river. So we get 6 months of really low flows, and then we've got about 20% that fills out the shoulder seasons. So real peaky, as you can tell. And the timing of the peak can be surprisingly off. We had May 31 on 2002, and I think 2018, 2020, I think I had May 27th as the peak day. And then in 2019, we went all the way out to July the 1st. So we can have a good 6 weeks variability in when that water comes down. Average is June the 7th. And then this year, very interesting. As I said, what you're looking at is a graph that's made up of 2 numbers, which is the Big Thompson above, which is the water that comes from really Rocky Mountain National Park, and the flow of the North Fork. And so notice how high the flow of the North Fork was this year. And the sense is a little bit misleading, because what we're seeing there with all that rain we had this year, yes, it certainly rained up at the higher elevations, but most of those storms were on the Front Range and up into the foothills. And so what happened here is we found way more water on the North Fork. Again, it's not, it's slightly lower elevations. So this is really that rain. And in fact, what it did eventually is it blew out our gauge. We no longer have a functional gauge on the North Fork here. Maybe our hydros this winter are going to go up and try and recreate the channel there, create a.
Do you think some of that is caused by the Cameron Peak fire runoff?
Yes, definitely. I mean, well, certainly partly the destruction of the gauge, it certainly had something to do with that. I have a slide towards the end where, right, Cameron Peak fire runoff has just been a massive burden on the river for the last 2-3 years. All of you guys know it. Ellen sitting back there, she knows what comes into even Johnstown's water treatment plant as being, water that looks like flowing mud is really what it amounts to. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, I guess you've got the Northern's discussion next week, but Colorado, Big Thompson. So I'm going to focus on the effects of this movement of all of this Colorado River water that passes or that uses the Big Thompson River to make its way down here to Carter and Horse Tooth. That obviously significantly impacts on how we manage the river. This is Adams Tunnel, the outlet of Adams Tunnel. So every single drop of that Colorado River water comes through here. Any of you guys know the YMCA of the Rockies, just walk up the road, half a mile, you'll run into this. So this is where it is. And yeah, it's the only, trans-basin diversion we have. One of the things to recognize is that the Bureau of Reclamation, in other words, the federal entity, operates and controls the movement of the water from the west slope to the east slope, all the way down essentially until it makes its way into Carter and Horse Tooth, and that's when Northern takes over and divvies the water out. That's not like these two don't significantly interact with each other. But for us as users here on the east slope, you're predominantly talking to Northern because, they're the guys you're getting water from. So all of that water, all of the Colorado River water, and all of the native flow of the Big Thompson from Rocky Mountain National Park, all winds up in Lake Estes. Yeah, people don't realize that. I'm always surprised. So, yeah, the CBT, right, they all come together. For the Big Thompson, it's the water from Rocky National Park. We've got a couple of smaller tributaries, mostly on the south side of the lake that also flow in. The CBT water, the Colorado River water, enters through the power plant that sits on the south bank of Lake Estes. It's really more accurate to think of Lake Estes as either the afterbay of the CBT power plant or possibly the forebay of the Olympus Tunnel. And the Olympus Tunnel is the tunnel system that takes all that Colorado River water and runs it down the mountain to essentially Loveland and Carter and Horse Tooth. So the thing about the Big Thompson River is there is no storage right in Lake Estes for Big Thompson water. In other words, Big Thompson water moves through the river, through Lake Estes every single day. It is not held there. Part of it does get used by the CBT project. Most importantly is what's called skim. So as the water moves from the west slope all the way down to the Big Thompson, it passes through a series of power plants, all this Colorado River water. It enables them, which are, by the way, operated by the Bureau of Reclamation, not Northern, but it enables them to offset part of the costs that we all pay for CBT water. And when there is enough water in the Big Thompson, what you say is it gets skimmed. The Big Thompson water gets pulled into the CBT system, used to generate power, and then placed back into the Big Thompson River at the canyon mouth, where in fact the most downstream power plant is. All of you guys who know where the dam store is, what most anybody doesn't recognize is right next door to the dam store is a power plant. And it's the final place where the skim water, the Big Thompson River water that's pulled through the power plants in the CBD system gets dumped back into the Big Thompson River right there. So, okay, the volume of CBT, 250,000 acre foot a year. So Mike talked about 400,000 acre foot on average, all of the trans-basin diversions that come into the South Platte. The CBT is, more than half of that entire volume. Average monthly volume of the CBT system is roughly 18,000 acre foot. Predominantly, they fill Carter and Horse Tooth in the middle of winter. So we have the highest flows of the Colorado River water in the middle of winter. We have the lowest flows in June. That provides a little extra space for the native Big Thompson water. So, pretty obvious, right? This is the native flow of the Big Thompson. This is the Colorado River water that's coming into Estes Park. Pretty obvious. There's a lot more Colorado River water than there is Big Thompson. If I put them both together, this is what the height of Lake Estes looks like. We see that 18,000 acre foot average value kind of is this background flow all year round. So if we do some math here, 250,000 acre foot of Colorado River water, only about 105,000 acre foot of native Big Thompson water. Lake Estes is pretty small. So on average, the entirety of the volume from Lake Estes turns over roughly every 2 to 2.5 days. Folks never realize, even people who live in Estes Park, they see the water that comes into the lake from Rocky Mountain National Park. They assume that what they're looking at is Big Thompson water, but you're not. Maybe the only month of the year in which you are looking at Big Thompson water is June. For the other 11 months of the water, it's Colorado River water. I mean, but then you go to Horsetooth and Carter, you're looking at Colorado River water. But I'm always surprised that folks who even live in Estes Park just don't understand this at all. So I briefly talked about it. There is no native storage right for Colorado, for Big Thompson water in Estes Park. So the native water has to come in and go out within a 24-hour period. So in other words, when you're looking at Lake Estes, you're looking at Colorado River water. So every day I talk to the Bureau of Reclamation and we have to figure out where this water is going. What water is going into their system in the Olympus Tunnel, what water is going to stay in the Big Thompson River and run down the canyon. We make that determination on the flows that we see each day at noon. We figure out what will be the release out of Lake Estes starting typically at midnight for the following 24-hour period. We tend to try to keep one change in flow every 24 hours. So it means you have flow release to the Big Thompson River. And that's why I said the Big Thompson River is not a native flowing river, because we're controlling the releases every 24 hours. We try and always keep those releases, particularly if they're big changes, we do them in the middle of the night to run down the canyon in the middle of the night. So if we have any fishermen here, if you don't do that, they could be standing and fishing in water this deep, and then 2 minutes later, the water could be this deep, and they really don't like that. So we try and do all of those big changes, in the middle of the night, and if we have to do them during the day, the Bureau tries to always sort of stagger them in smaller intervals so that the river doesn't rise hugely like that. And I'm always surprised, even 8 years. We do that gate change at midnight, and it moves us away from down the river. I can see it on the Loveland gauge on the east side of Loveland. I'm always surprised that it keeps itself as a wavefront all the way down the river, really until you're on the east side of I-25 is where you can't really see that anymore. Okay, going on with that, but as we all know, if you will know next week, we're getting a new reservoir. It's a Colorado water reservoir. It's for Windy Gap water. Windy Gap water, I'm sure they will talk about, is meant for municipal purposes, non-agricultural purposes. CBT was designed to be primarily for agricultural purposes. The Windy Gap water is non-agricultural purposes. They are currently building the reservoir due west of Carter. When it's combined, the 4 reservoirs, Horsetooth, Carter, Chimney Hollow, and Boulder together will hold about 370,000 acre foot of storage. Chimney Hollow is about 90,000. But just to put that into perspective, Granby holds about 470,000. So even though Horsetooth, Carter, and Chimney Hollow are really our largest storage vessels on the entire South Platte, Yeah, they're not holding native water, they're holding Colorado River water. And, you know, you could put all of them together and fit them into Granby quite easily. So that's what it looks like. That's what you're looking at here is, you're looking due east. This is Carter Lake here. This is the dam wall under construction. These are the pipelines that bring this CBT water down and then divide it out to Carter and Horsetooth. This is the downstream side of the dam wall. This is the upstream side. So this is what's going to be underwater eventually. This is a 350-foot tall dam, so tall, right? So yeah, this will stay looking like this. This will be underwater. When's it going to be finished? End of 2024, 2025? Not my fault, right? Who knows? It seems to be going really well, but Northern will probably know better. Briefly, the major ditches on the Big Thompson. We've got them over here. One of the characteristics of the Big Thompson, which is different from the Poudre, is we have a lot of ditches in very close proximity. So roughly from the west side of Loveland to the Hillsborough on the east side, it's only about 12 miles. And we have really almost all of the major ditches in that 12-mile reach. So it means everybody has to really work very well together.
Did those ditch companies come about after the CBT?
Oh, no,
was finished?
every one of these is.
I'm just
No,
curious.
no. I think our most junior rights that I actually deal with as a daily value for direct irrigation water, I think is roughly 1871.
Wow.
So all of them, you know, it's roughly 1861 to 1871 is our priority range, which we operate in during the summer months. The reservoirs have somewhat more junior storage priorities, usually the 1900s to 1920s are the largest range for the storage rights that happen in winter. So again, getting back to that 1897, when Mike talked about the 1897 for the South Platte Compact, I mean, understand that if you're on the tributaries here all the way through summer, you know, we're dealing with water rights that are significantly more senior to that. Biggest diverters, the GLIC system. The GLIC system owns and operates Boyd, Horsetooth, and Lake Loveland. And the second largest one is Home Supply System, which operates Lone Tree and the city of Loveland. GLIC is really big. So if you drive along Highway 34, anywhere between Loveland and the east side of Greeley, the irrigation that you see on either side of you is coming from the GLIC system. This is a lot. This is a lot of dam storage for you know, the reservoir down here. Municipalities. This is a heavily municipal district. The little stars are the folks who primarily get their water from the Big Thompson. I think Milliken should probably be included in that. They get their waters from wells, but their wells on the Big Thompson. Windsor, Greeley, and Evans. The Big Thompson water is a supplemental water. It's a smaller component they use. The Poudre River would really be their primary sources. And then the other thing, which almost flies below everybody's radar, is something called the Little Thompson Water District. It is for folks who live really outside of the municipal areas. It goes all the way up to Masonville, all the way south down into Longmont, all the way out west to really with the confluence of the Big Thompson and the South Platte. So in other words, on the east side of Milliken, it's really a municipal water provider, but it has a very large service area, and folks don't know about it because historically it's really only used CBT or windy gap water, non-native water. But that is beginning to change. They currently have a decree going through court that for Big Thompson water.
And just to clarify, this is from the river directly, not from the CBT.
Correct.
Yeah, which is ultimately from.
Oh, you also, the last thing you know is, of course, nobody uses the Little Thompson because it's so. A lot of people dump excess water into the Little Thompson, but nobody actually uses the Little Thompson, which they would. So, you know, we have, I guess, part of your project here, you will be talking about this later, is, right, these water rights started out as irrigation
And so cities buy shares of these ditches, and then they have to go to court to change that water, because it's no longer being used for irrigation. It's being used for a variety of municipal purposes. It's going to be used in maybe in different locations. It'll certainly be diverted off the river at a different location. And they need it through winter, right? Because we all want to open the tap and flush the toilet and shower all the way through winter. But that is not the historical pattern of irrigation. So when a municipality buys shares and goes through court and makes those changes, that's what we call all plans, or return flow plans, or change share plans. And that's really become probably the driver for what I do now as the river commissioner, is these decrees are become extremely complex, because everybody wants to make sure that with these changed uses and the changed times of use, how do the historic guys, the ditches, how do they make sure that they're not harmed? So a tremendous amount of analysis comes into this. Everybody has to have their 2 cents worth. And so what we wind up with is these very large decrees, which what I say is have 30 pages of, fine print, right? Terms and conditions. But the fact of the matter, my job is to administer the decrees of the court. So if these are the decrees that go through the court, then it becomes my job to administer them, all of our jobs. That's really the state engineer's job. So if you're a water commissioner now in Division 1, because we are municipalities, because the majority of people in this state live here on the Front Range, this is what I do now. The administration of these changed water rights, all of those pages of terms and conditions, which again, that's what my job is, right? I don't get to decide I'll do one and not the other. That's what the court said, that's what we do. This is where we take up the majority of our time now. And it's something to think about philosophically is, how does the world change when a municipality is now the primary owner and then finally the primary user of a ditch? How do we need to rethink what we're looking at for those water rights? How do they work? How do we administer them? And that's really how we're going to go in the future. This is how it works. In-stream flow requirements, big difference between the Big Thompson and the Poudre. In the Big Thompson, once we get past essentially Dilly Tunnel or roughly the canyon entrance, there are no more in-stream flow requirements. I can and I do what we call sweep the river. In other words, that ditch structure there is taking all of the flow of the river and diverting it into their head gates, essentially leaving the river dry directly below. As a practical matter, this mostly happens, in other words, where you'll physically see it dry. It happens in the winter months mostly for us. But this is just on the west side of London. You don't really get that in the Poudre because there are some in-stream flow requirements, much more so that keep the water in the river, or some water in the river. Again, talking back to the effects of the Cameron Peak fire, this and gunk, black, sticky gunk. Every time it rains, huge amounts of debris coming down the river. This is where are they? They're at Wilson in the big town in Loveland. This is just off Wilson Avenue. So this, I took this last year. Last year was worse than this year, but every time it rains, massive amounts of debris. That's bad enough, but what really kills is this fine, silty, hydrophobic material that comes down. City of Loveland has just been battling this for years because they do pull water right off the river. It just gunks up their inlet structures. And even when they can get it through, it creates an odor that even their treatment systems can't necessarily get rid of the odor, or at least to the level that they wanted to. So it's really been, particularly for Loveland, it's just a constant battle the last 2-3 years.
with this coming through. That's it. My plug for the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition. They have become a very useful tool and a very useful meeting point to put together various entities. And we're looking for various things on the Big Thompson. They've spent the last couple of years doing fire remediation. I know they're now moving back towards perhaps picking up some of their water and river regime operations that they were looking at. That's it.
We have 2 questions. We gotta do a quick turnaround, get our lunch and come back in so we can hear Mayor Arndt talk. So any questions for Jean?
I guess it's a question for either Gene or Michael. Would you help me understand a little bit better, how CFS translates? So I understand it's the cubic feet per second or whatever. How does that translate into acre feet? So if a river is pulling 500 CFS, what does that mean?
1.9835.
Acre feet per.
No, other way around. Right, multiply CFS by 1.9835
Okay.
To get 1 acre foot.
to get 1 acre foot.
And that's essentially running the CFS for 24 hours.
Right, so basically, if you run 1 CFS for 24 hours, you've essentially diverted 2 acres.
Okay, so when they take out 500 CFS road.
It's just, yeah, it's slightly less than 1,000 acre foot,
Yeah.
980 acre foot. Yeah,
Thank
per
you.
day, right?
Yeah.
Cubic foot per second, but it's an acre foot per day value, difference between a flow rate and a volume, right?
Thank
All
you.
right,
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. So please grab your lunches, come back in here and we'll try to get started hopefully around 12-ish. If we can make that happen. Thank you both so much.
so you're on the north.
Yesterday, she's like.
Go in the canyon, then put it in. Yeah. It only flows with all the streams. When that's full, I'm gonna see it. Oh, okay. And we have this already. You know, so we were just like, hey, you should have something to add your shit to this. Well, about kind of the. Yeah, so then we debate, my friends and I, how we see it.
Well,
So we're, we guess about two. You can go on with that.
Website and look for, Mike said that slide. And you can go and. It's one.
Yeah, you subtract that.
Yeah. Are you speaker or student?
I'm a student.
Or nice.
Where you want?
And then. I saw you speaking. Again.
I just, sorry, I kept hearing that too, so I.
Once you know that, I think it's crack.
Yeah, and it's.
Exactly, yeah, then they get.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey.
Mayor, how are you?
Great. Nice to see you. Nice to see you're being honored as a. Yeah, sorry. No,
That's one thing.
well,
Like you distinguish before exchanges, right?
I'm being honored at Purdue for the same thing in 3 weeks, and I was like, so that, that means I will, or they hit the bottom of the barrel, they're like, oh,
Congratulations. That's very cool.
you too, isn't that funny? I'm like, what? I'm gonna go back there, I'm like, oh, that's how it's working, like, that's like, it's not like, you're like everyone. Yeah.
Good.
My major professor in a retirement home in, almost like Oklahoma, switching parents.